Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We're going to spend some time in this first hour talking about what we can do to really turn around some of the schools and even the communities in the inner city. And we're going to once again talk about what has been happening in West Dallas through the West Dallas Community School. I think you're going to be very encouraged, but I also want to challenge some of the rest of you listening to this program to consider what you might do in your community. We bring back to the microphone an individual that's been on the program with me before, Bentley Kraft, who serves as the head of school for West Dallas Community School. It is a private classical Christian educational school, and he has a bachelor's degree in English literature from the University of Texas at Austin, master's degree in education from the University of Virginia. He served in the past in a variety of capacities at places like Trinity Christian Academy, and of course right now is the head of school at West Dallas Community School. Bentley, welcome back to the microphone.
Thank you for having me back, Kerby.
We are going to spend some time talking about some things you and I have talked about before, but also get into some other topics. And in order to make that happen, we also welcome to the microphone Robert Hunt, who currently serves as the Director of Development at West Dallas Community School, graduate of Texas A&M and Aggie in finance, and he has been in that position for 3 years. So again, thank you for joining us as well.
It's my pleasure. Glad to be here.
I know some of our listeners mightn't be familiar with the history, but I know that we've added new stations since you've been here, and not everybody remembers every detail. So let's, if we can, maybe go back a little bit and talk about the history of West Dallas Community School, because number one, I want people to understand what a success it has been. But number two, to really maybe get the vision that they could do something similar like this in their own community. What are your thoughts?
Great. No, and it's unique history. It's one we like to share, and we're nearly celebrating 20 years, so it's fun to talk about. So it goes back to one individual in particular, Reverend Arva Wilson.
Yes.
So pastor, had grown up in the community of West Dallas, had left, sworn he never come back, but had the call from the Lord to return to West Dallas in the capacity of a minister, and planted a church. And he quickly recognized there was a need in the community for a Christ-centered school. He thought that would make a big difference in the lives of the young people and in the community at large. But it wasn't until a few years later, where he was speaking at church, that another woman heard him speak and share his vision, and that was Robin Lewis. And her story is unique. And then years later, after the two of them connected and had been praying and actually looking for an eventual head of school, did Carol Sanju come on the scene. So it was those three individuals and their spouses. So Pastor Wilson and his wife, Mrs. Wilson, Robin and Michael Lewis, and Carol and Norm Sanju. And so after years of prayer, those three couples came together with this vision for a rigorous school of excellence, a Christ-centered school serving the kids in West Dallas, an area of Dallas that had long been forgotten and synonymous with hopelessness, crime, overcrowded public housing. Became a place where an excellent school drawing kids to Christ could be planted. So they started in 1995. Just send them to the public school. This was a lot more difficult. They were asking parents to pay tuition, to provide their children with uniforms, to get them to school each morning. Back in those days, they had to pack their own lunches. They weren't providing lunch or breakfast as we do today. And so those early parents went out on faith, just as our founders did. I mean, it was beautiful to see the exercise of faith that occurred back then. And God was faithful, of course, to provide. And over time, grow the school, and here we are today with 260 students in grades pre-K to 8.
That's incredible. I remember early on when Carol Sanju invited me down and I got a chance to see how it was developing. Of course, we have quite a facility, and I might say we because you've been nice enough to have me on the board for many years. And I think almost every time Tom Leppard's been on the program, for a while he was mayor and then he was running for Senate. So whenever he was on, I don't think there was ever an interview we did with Tom Leppard we didn't talk about West Dallas Community Schools. So it's gotten some visibility. But for a lot of our listeners, I want to give them a feel for that community. Is it fair, Bentley, to say that this is one of the poor communities, not only in Dallas, but really in the United States? In other words, if you can grow a school there, it seems to me you could do this almost anywhere if you found enough dedicated people to try to bring that about.
Yes. I'm not a native Dallasite, but from my understanding, and as I've read the story, West Dallas in the 80s and early 90s was one of the poorest communities in the United States.
Yes.
By all metrics. So education, median income, crime. When Clinton came to office, I believe Dallas, West Dallas, that neighborhood was one of the major sites to work with the EPA because of a lead smelting plant. So there was real poison in the soil and the water, and then there was poison in the atmosphere, if you will. So it was toxic through and through. And so if God can plant a school like West Dallas there, then he can do it anywhere. And if you feel like your community, that wouldn't work, well, I would just encourage you to look to the scriptures, to get on your knees and to trust God a little bit more deeply.
That's amazing. Robert, let me come to you for just a minute. I'd love to get your thoughts about some of the students you've met, some of the families. You've been there for a couple of years now, and you have, in some respects, a fresh set of eyes to maybe educate some of our listeners about what West Dallas is like and what you've been able to see at West Dallas Community School.
Sure. Well, unlike Bentley, I am a native Dallasite, so
Yes.
It has been an absolute pleasure for me to become more engaged in the West Dallas community, because it was one that growing up was not one that you would typically travel to. And so one of the real gifts that the school gives to both parents and their children is this safe place of West Dallas Community School, and one that ultimately God's word is the final authority. And so whether parents know that implicitly or explicitly, they when they walk through the doors, they know this is a place that their child will be well loved and they will be well loved and respected. And so I've gotten a front row seat. Really, one of the main tenets of my work is to connect people with the cause. And so when I walk people through that building and I walk them into a room and there are third graders talking about the Old Testament and how it connects with the New Testament and how God's word is our final authority, it was a different view of education than one that I had been familiar with. And as Bentley had mentioned, to take place in that context and in a community that historically had been underserved and been an area of hopelessness, it's the gospel that offers us hope, regardless of your economic background, but more particularly for that community to be able to hold on to the gospel and to receive it with an education that's rigorous and filled with excellence.
When we come back from the break, I want to talk a little bit about why a classical Christian school, and certainly that plays to your strength, Bentley, because that has been your background, and certainly you've been involved with that with other schools, and what is actually taught and how people can get involved. Also, I want to come back, Robert, and talk a little bit about a luncheon that you're going to have, because you have one of your all-time success stories that is going to be part of that luncheon, and at least for our Dallas listeners, they might be able to attend. But let me, just before I go to a break, mention that we have a number of ways in which you can find out more about this particular school and how you might want to learn more about what you might want to do with it in your community. First, we have an article that was written about the school, A School for Inner City Shalom, and it's in our articles section. If you go to our web links section, there is a section there in which we have a link to West Dallas Community School. And then also there is a 7-minute video, The History of West Dallas Community School. I would encourage you to watch it. It will be very encouraging to you, but after you've watched that 7-minute video, let me also encourage you then to hit the share button. You can put that then on your Facebook page. You could put it on your blog. You could send it to someone else. And we're going to continue our conversation with Bentley Craft and Robert Hunt as we talk about West Dallas Community School. All that coming up right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
Over the last few decades, I have followed the philosophical twists and turns of the environmental movement. As a student, I participated in the first Earth Day back in 1970 by inviting a Sierra Club leader to speak to my high school. I've also noticed how environmentalism almost became a religion. The philosophy of pantheism began to gain more prominence in the movement, and Earth worship almost became a foundational tenet of environmentalism. I've also noticed an increasing condemnation of the free market within the environmental movement, and there was always the belief that the only solution to many of our environmental problems was a global government. Nevertheless, I was always uncomfortable when a speaker at a political event or a guest on my radio program would link environmentalism to communism. You've probably heard the line, the environmental movement is like a watermelon, green on the outside, red on the inside. But you know, the latest environmental declaration makes me think that those observations weren't too far off target. Environmental activists from 130 different environmental groups call for an end to capitalism and the free market system. The Margarita Declaration, which was drafted in Venezuela, declares that global warming cannot be stopped without ending the capitalist system. You know, actually, a free market and private property are important tools in dealing with most forms of pollution. You know, if you own your land, you're likely to take care of it. If everyone owns the land, like in socialism, often nobody takes care of it. Professor Garrett Harding called this the tragedy of the commons. You could also call it the tragedy of the public restroom. Think of a mess in a typical public restroom. Now compare that to the bathroom in your home. When something is held in common, no one feels the same responsibility as when they own it themselves. So, you know, we may have environmental problems to address in our world, but ending capitalism and the free market is not the way to solve them. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again when we are talking today about West Dallas Community School, but broader, to really talk about what we can and should do as Christians to reach out to those in our community. I think you're really going to be encouraged today as we talk about some of the success of this school, and I hope that I can really challenge many of you to think about what you might want to do in your own community. Bentley Craft with us, Robert Head, and for just a minute, Bentley, let me maybe give your background, because we're going to talk about this idea of a classical Christian education. And I have certainly was so thrilled when they made you the headmaster, because you bring so much to the table in terms of an understanding of that idea of classical Christian education. But give us a little of your background and why indeed you are such a perfect fit, I think, for the position you're in.
Well, thank you. I don't know about that, but my background is that I went to the University of Texas and studied literature and started to work on my education degree. And I thought it was the first time I recognized that this was in many ways counter to my Christian faith, and trying to make sense of the philosophy of education, the approach, the view of the human person, anthropology that jived with the scriptures. It wasn't there. And so I walked away a little jaded, and thankfully, a few years later, God called me to a small school in Arlington, Virginia called Rivendell School, started in the late 80s. And it was founded on the teachings, the writings, the philosophy of Charlotte Mason.
Charlotte Mason.
So, yes. British philosopher of education, turn of the century. Most of her work was done at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s. And it was her work that informed Robin Lewis. So fast forwarding to one of the founders of West Dallas Community School, as Robin looked for a model for a rigorous Christ-centered school for her own children, she didn't find one. And so she went searching far and wide, visiting different schools, reading broadly, and came across the 6-tome volume of Charlotte Mason's Philosophy of Education. And that's what became kind of the soil for her first school, Providence, then later West Dallas Community School. So when we use classical, we don't necessarily mean what everyone means these days, because classical schools have really come into their own. And so that term is a little bit contested. But what we mean by that is an education rooted in the classics, things that have stood the test of time, works of human ingenuity that have endured. So works of art and music and writing. We're inviting students into a great conversation. So when we talk about a classical approach to education, it is that view of education where it's not about training for a vocation and a training for a job. No, it's about training for a life. And so we are much more interested in the types of people our children are becoming than that they will graduate from high school or go to college. We want those things for them. We want them, we talk about breaking a cycle of poverty in West Dallas, but we know at the end of the day, if they haven't had an encounter with a living God, if they don't have a vision for their life in Christ or an understanding of who they are in Christ, then we'll have some gains, but really it's not worth all the effort. I would say the educational vision is somewhat vacuous without that. So I could go on, but
let me jump on because a lot of people might say, well, you're really dealing with an impoverished area. You're dealing with African American kids, Hispanic American kids. We just need to give them the basics. Instead, you really affirm them by saying, no, we can give them really what could be considered pretty challenging information, challenging kind of education and curriculum. And in a sense, you're affirming them and saying, we're going to set the bar higher, and we believe that you need to really be part of what have been the canon of Western culture.
Yeah, I would say it would be offensive and selling them short if we said, we just need to teach them writing and arithmetic and kind of stop there. So, we want to put before them the greatest works that have ever been written and really nurture their moral imagination. And yet, we recognize the context. So context does affect many things. And so studies have shown that many kids coming out of impoverished situations and home life come to school having heard 30 million fewer words than a working class family, perhaps. And that affects the neurology and their school readiness. And so there's work to be done with phonics and reading. And but aiming towards, again, it's what are your aims? So then a great article and an address T.S. Eliot gave after he came to Christ at the University of Chicago. This was in the 30s. He said, when you talk about education, you have to ask, well, what is education for? But you have to back up and say, well, what is a human being for?
Yes.
And so we believe that the anthropology matters. So if you view the human person as created in God's image, made to worship, it can change everything. So Charlotte Mason talks about education as atmosphere, life, habits. And she said, at the end of schooling, you shouldn't ask how much does the student know, but how much does the student care? Which echoes Augustine's view of, well, if you really want to know someone, don't ask what they know, ask what they've come to love. And so we recognize that we are, in every moment of the day, nurturing the children's affections. We're trying to put before them, again, drawing on the classics, those things that are true, good, and beautiful. Yes. And beautiful is not subjective. There's an objective reality to beauty. If beauty draws you towards things that are wholesome and pure and good and true, that's how you measure beauty. If you're attracted to it and it draws you elsewhere, then it's not beauty. But that's what we're working on, is having them worship, ultimately, the author of all that's good, true, and beautiful.
Again, not selling them short, but giving them an opportunity. And Robert, last time you and I were in the same room, we were at the Fine Arts Night, in which these young people had posted, and there were pictures, their sculptures, their paintings, and all sorts of things. And I think you and my wife and I were both saying, a lot of this is even better than some of the things we could do. And we were just absolutely blown away at the level of technical expertise and the kind of emphasis on excellence that is at West Dallas Community School.
Absolutely right. And I have to mention our art teacher, Angela Elledge, who brings a great deal of expertise and excellence and rigor to that program. Whenever visitors come to the school, they are surprised at how long our students will spend on art projects. Typically, in an art class, the temptation will be to take a day or two, put something together, and you've done your project. But to go back to what Bentley spoke of with Charlotte Mason caring about these disciplines, we see our children being able to work on a project for 6 months at a time as a really important discipline and for them to know that excellence will be expected of them in every subject. It's not just art, but in art and in music and in their physical education, and yes, in math and literature. And so we have a view of education that doesn't silo the subjects. And so that same excellence that you and I saw, Kerby, at Fine Arts Night, we would have seen the same thing in the math class and in the science lab. And ultimately it's because we want to tell these students that whatever they do, they're supposed to work heartily as unto the Lord and not unto men. So it's an offering unto the Lord. So our desire for that Fine Arts Night was, yes, it's nice for visitors to see the building and see the children, but ultimately it's unto the Lord, as with everything that we do.
It really gets back, Bentley, to this idea of a Christian worldview. And last week we got talking about Dorothy Sayers and Douglas Wilson and all sorts of lost tools of learning and things like that. Of course, we mentioned Charlotte Mason and many others that we can mention. But this is what I hope not only the individuals listening right now see as a vision to maybe something they want to do in their community, but for those listening right now, maybe they're even teachers that haven't gone back to school yet and want to teach from a Christian point of view in a Christian school, a charter school, whatever it might be. We're really talking about taking the entire Christian perspective and applying it to every area of life, the lordship of Christ over every area of life, including education. Is that what we're talking about?
It is. I mean, I think about Paul's admonition for us to be ambassadors, that we've all been given the ministry of reconciliation. I think he was specifically talking about reconciling people back to God. But it's broader than that. And you see it in Romans as Paul talks about kind of all things being restored. And in Colossians, all things are held together in Christ. So I think one of the tasks of the Christian in this age is to reconcile knowledge back to its creator and author and to itself and one another. And so over time, education has siloed the different disciplines, and so they don't speak to one another. There's no cohesive vision or whole, and there's no sense of any kind of embedded meaning in it. And so part of the task is to put everything under the lens of Scripture, but also to recognize, as Abraham Kuyper says, there's not one square inch over the whole creation over which the Lord has not proclaimed mine. So everything is kind of on the table, worthy of exploration, discovery, and as we send them out into the world, all vocations done unto the Lord can bring great glory to Him and benefit the world. So we talk about also this school being for the good of the city and the glory of God. Wow. So we have definitely a vision for discipling our students, but recognizing that it's also for the common good, that they will be great neighbors and citizens, and that it can affect all of West Dallas, the whole community. So community is something I'd love to talk about later because it's such a critical piece of who we are.
Well, that's what we're going to talk about next, but I'm glad you quoted Abraham Kuyper. I love that quote. And, you think about what the university was, una, one, veritas, one, truth. The idea was that the university shouldn't have these silos, which they do, that all should be speaking to that. Now, I have been on a few Christian university campuses where there is some of that, but that idea of every area of life certainly needs to come under the lordship of Jesus Christ, and certainly that is what you're trying to teach there. We're going to take a break. We're going to talk about community, also talk about some of the challenges in that community, and that will be something that we will cover in just a few minutes. But also, let me open up the phones. Perhaps you have a comment or a question about this school, or maybe you're trying to do something similar in your own community. If you'd like to join us, I know most of you are going to kind of sit back and listen and hear this, I think, very encouraging story today about what has happened over 20 years at West Dallas Community School. But if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. And if you'd like to know a little bit more, we have a link to West Dallas Community School. We have an article on a school for inner city shalom. And of course, we have the video, the history of the West Dallas community. We hope that you'll take the time to visit that on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this. listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talking today with Bentley Kraft and Robert Head. They are with West Dallas Community School. We'll give you some more information about them in just a minute. But let's, if we can, I've said Robert Head. I meant Hunt. I don't know why I said that. I've said that wrong a couple of times. I really apologize for that. And let's, if we can, go to John in Texas, KBGS. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're on the air.
All righty. Yeah, I was just, since the school's been around a while, I just thought they might recount maybe one or two individuals who stayed in the community or gone elsewhere and been salt and light.
That's a great question. And so we started in 1995, but it took a while before we produced our first graduating class. And at this point, we've seen our graduates go on to a number of local private schools, independent schools, some Christ-centered, some not. Many have gone on to the public schools. But right now, it's been about 50% have gone on to area public schools and others private. And then from that, we've had 97% of our graduates go on to graduate from high school. And now we're just starting to see our first cohort, if you will, of students start graduate from college. And so we've got a couple of neat stories right now. From our first graduating class, we've got a young man who's out in California pursuing his MD. We have another graduate who went on to Dallas Baptist University and is now serving on the Dallas Police Force. And so Timothy Jackson, who came back this last year to speak to our 8th graders, and we'll talk a little bit more about him later, but he's going to speak at our luncheon this fall. But that's one of our great stories. And we're also really excited that this spring we hired our first alumnus to come back and teach at our school. So Amber Kelly went on to Baylor University, just graduated. She'll be teaching Class 4 this year.
That's good. Robert Hunt, let me come to you real quickly because we're going to encourage at least some of the people in Dallas to actually hear the testimony of one of your graduates, which we just talked about.
Mm-hmm. Timothy Jackson, who is on the police force, as Bentley mentioned, was a graduate of Dallas Baptist University, attended our school, grew up in the community, and will be telling his story. And we were so impressed when he came back and spoke to our 8th graders and talked to them about his own testimony and how the Lord used the school, but also a mother that cared deeply about him and other mentors in his life to carry him to the place it is today. And he's a man of God who really desires to make a difference in the city of Dallas and felt that serving in our police force was a great way to do that. And so he has worked the West Dallas area before, and as you can imagine, knows it quite well, and worked other areas of Dallas. But we are delighted that he will be our featured speaker on October 22nd at the Belo Mansion, and this is a fundraising luncheon. The way our financial model works is that 90% of the operating funds needed to carry on this work are given from private sources. So we do ask parents to pay as they're able, which comes to roughly 10%. But this fundraising luncheon, where Timothy will be our featured speaker, is a way to ensure that children like Timothy can continue to attend our Christ-centered School of Rigor. And so if you have interest in attending that, we'll be in Dallas. You can email events@wdcschool.org, and we'd be delighted to have you there.
And we do have a link to West Dallas Community School. And Bentley, let me come back to you because Robert was talking about the fact that we do require that every parent pay something, but it's kind of on a sliding scale. And so I appreciate the fact that on the one hand, they can't pay the whole freight. Right. But on the other hand, you have, again, affirming individuals using kind of a biblical model that they should have something and give something towards the education of their children.
Right. I mean, justice animates much of what we do at West Dallas Community School. It's certainly something that drew me there. And there's this, you mentioned the article, Inner City Shalom. I think it's education as shalom. We're trying to bring wholeness in people's lives and in the community. And so for me, after years of serving in Christ-centered schools, I came to a place where, boy, I'd like to be able to offer this type of education, which I believe in so deeply, to those families and kids who would love that opportunity but just can't afford it. It's either not in their neighborhood or there's just no way, given their income, they could afford that.
Yes.
And so that's why West Dallas Community School is so unique in offering this type of excellent Christ-centered education. But it wouldn't serve the parents and kids well, ultimately, I would say, if it was free. So we say, no, we're going to show them the dignity they deserve, saying we know you can make the sacrifices to contribute to your child's education. So we ask you to pay something. So everyone pays something. Some people work and volunteer at the school to defray their tuition, but they often also have to pay for uniforms. They have to get their child to school, and we require the parents to attend 6 of 9 parent enrichment evenings. So those are times we're trying to really pour into their lives and to help equip the families. We want to partner with them. So we want them to be involved in the life of their child and the life of the school. And so that's a critical piece of community in our name.
Let's talk about that idea of community, because I've had a chance to speak at a few of those parent events, and we all are familiar with whether it's in the public schools, the PTA, or in Christian schools, parent-teacher fellowships and things of that nature, but those are optional. But for you, they are not. In other words, you say if your child is going to be in the school, we not only want to pour into him or her, we want to pour some things into you as well.
Correct. So, contingent on re-enrollment is their participation in these evenings. And so today, as we were meeting, we saw some parents up and down the hallway of our school because they're making up for those hours. So maybe there's a scheduling conflict or whatnot. They weren't able to attend, but they want to bring their child back next year. So we have them watch a video series on parenting. So anything we can do to enrich their lives. So topics range from how do you help your child navigate the digital age, to eating right, to discipline in the home, teaching your kids to be responsible. The topics are broad ranging, but always with this Christ-centered biblical view in mind.
Robert, let's, if we can, talk about that fundraising challenge, because I think right now some people are saying, this is something we might want to do in our community, but, okay, there are parents that are not going to be able to really come close to paying the kind of tuition that would be necessary to support a Christian school. So you have a daunting responsibility, that is to raise the funds necessary through like-minded individuals, compassionate individuals who recognize the value of that school. So can you speak to that issue for a minute?
Sure. It's a privilege to be able to connect people with our school. And as Bentley mentioned, we see the children that attend our school as born persons, made in the image of God, and therefore worthy of the very best in art, music, and literature. Well, we see donors as born persons, made in the image of God, and therefore they're to be treated as image bearers. And so we have this idea, much of which has been informed by Gary Hogue and his work, that this can be discipleship. And so the funding needs can be daunting, but it is the Lord's ministry, and it is our job to love our donors well and to connect them with the cause. And what ends up happening is you end up seeing the West Dallas Community School is not just a ministry to children and families in West Dallas, but it's to all of Dallas, as people in North Dallas and South Dallas and East Dallas are connected. And it's more of a blessing to give than to receive. And many of our donors feel that and see that, and I get the privilege of connecting them and ensuring that they can be a blessing to others and then be blessed by doing that.
You know, that partnership is going to be key if others want to do something like this, because it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Stockton, California, Tupelo, Mississippi, whether you're talking about Detroit, Michigan, or whether you're talking about Cincinnati, Ohio. There are communities where there is a financial resource that, if invested carefully in some of those very difficult parts of that community, that town, or that city, that partnership between those individuals could make this happen. And if we're going to expect success, it's going to be requiring the kind of partnership that you've been working on.
Exactly. And it comes back to prayer. And so the story of West Dallas Community School is a story of prayer, and the story of other schools that are similar to us, and there are others throughout the country who are, it comes back to prayer. So when you talk to folks who have had ministries in these economically depressed areas, you eventually find out that someone prayed for about a decade or so, and that who knew the money came.
Yeah. Well, I need to take a break. When we come back, though, maybe we can talk about how you find that Arvil Wilson, or whoever that might be, or that Robin Lewis or Carol Sanju, or whoever that might be. But also, I'd love to, when we come back, Bentley, talk about, well, how successful has it been? Graduation rates, what kind of schools they've made themselves, and have they been able to be successful? We've talked about a couple of successes, but maybe you can give us a few facts and figures real quickly, and we'll give you a chance. If you'd like to join the conversation today, you can call us 1-800-351-1212. And I do really want to challenge some of you to consider what you might do to look at an area in your town, your community, your city, and recognize that maybe there's something you can do, as these individuals have done, to be a blessing in that community and to bring the hope of Jesus Christ, the classical Christian education that we've talked about, and really a sense of shalom in the midst of that inner city. So let me encourage you again to go to our website. You'll find the articles, A School for Inner City Shalom. We have the video, The History of West Dallas Community School, and of course we have a link to West Dallas in case you, especially in the Dallas area, would like to attend that luncheon and find out a little bit more. We'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll take some more phone calls. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to listen to us again, don't forget that we have a live cast and a podcast, and you can watch it again and watch it even right now. We'll take a break and be back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
But for a few more minutes, if you'd like to join us real quickly, 1-800-351-1212. Bentley Craft and Robert Hunt, and we are, again, talking about West Dallas Community School. As head of school, I guess you keep track of those statistics. You sort of gave us a little bit of a look, but I'm sure some people are saying, okay, well, you graduate them, then they leave your school, they go into the terrible public schools, and every bit of positive you've been able to build up gets drained. But that's not what's happening, is it?
No, historically, that's not what we've seen. Again, so we've graduated nearly 70 students, I believe. I'm just looking at Robert Hunt, making sure that's right. I think that's true. Again, this is just my second year at West Dallas Community School. But so 50% of our students have matriculated on to Townview, which is a magnet school in Dallas, and other area public schools. And then the other 50% have gone, many of them have gone to some of the Christ-centered classical schools in the area, or some of the other Christian schools, and some of the most kind of prestigious independent schools in Dallas, like Hockaday and St. Mark's and Ursuline. And we've seen them make that transition well, and then head on to college for many of them.
They didn't just survive; they thrived.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so people often ask us, and you being a board member would know this question because you probably heard it: why don't you have a high school?
Yeah.
And so, again, just my second year, I haven't made the decision to be a pre-K to 8 school, but I would defend that because I think we want to keep the schools small so kids can be known.
Yes.
And also, I think it's wise for our students, many of whom have grown up in West Dallas. They might be the first in their generation to even consider college, for them to experience the transition from a small school like West Dallas to a bigger school, to learn how to manage the temptations and kind of the rough and tumble of the world under the roof of their parents' home, and then to have this community at West Dallas Community School to come back to and to draw strength from. And I think that's better, I would argue, than to have a small high school where they might grow, but it might become more over time, more of a unhealthy hothouse for them. Also, high school is very expensive, and you heard Robert talk about the financial model. So
can't even imagine.
No,
yeah.
so also just logistically, we're just not sure that's what we're called to do right now. But again, right at this point, 97% of our kids have graduated from high school, and we're thrilled about that. But as we said earlier, it's not about graduating from high school or graduating from college. We try to cast a vision for our students. It's not about their job either. It's got to be a much more sustaining vision than that, one that is about serving the Lord with all the gifts they've been given.
Wow.
And we're seeing that too. So that's what's exciting about Timothy Jackson, Amber Kelly, and Bryson Williams, a young man studying to be a doctor out in California, is to see them look back to West Dallas as a place where they learned about God and their place in the world.
What a contrast. I know you've seen the film Waiting for Superman, and you've lived in Washington, D.C. I've lived outside of Washington, D.C. I certainly am very familiar with what inner city poverty looks like, but more importantly, the horrible schools that some of these children have to go to. And, of course, the theme, for those that are not familiar with in Waiting for Superman, they're really hoping that they can win the lottery and then put their child in a classical, maybe really just a charter school, not even a classical Christian school, just even a charter school, just something else. And I think this is why we really want to cast this vision, because there is an answer. It's going to have to come primarily from the private sector. It's going to have to come from individual donors that Robert Hunt is contacting, and you. But I do believe that this is the ultimate answer to some of the problems of poverty and crime and the difficulties we have in the inner city, because when you graduate, first of all, most of them don't graduate from high school, but even if they do graduate from high school, they are not going to compete in the 21st century, are they?
Well, they're not. I mean, there's a lot we could go into here. You think about just kind of the unmet promises of our founding fathers, and then the grand vision of Horace Mann to educate the population. It's fundamentally unjust the way the public school system is structured, and
it's true,
and the way in which we see certain zip codes are disproportionately represented in the penal code, and they're often getting kicked out of these schools, or you can see schools being represented in the penal code in a disproportionate way. So, but the problem with the church trying to address that is that there is this Berlin Wall, of iron curtain between church and state. And so how can we bring our faith into public square? Well, we've been told we can't. And so we believe this independent school is really the only way you can offer this type of rigorous, Christ-centered, life-changing education. So it requires a lot of faith. It requires a lot of money. But it requires a lot of imagination and vision. And so we're so excited to be able to offer this kind of education to these students. And we see them just flourish. And so you hear parents saying thank you for the way that the scriptures have become kind of a part and parcel of our life at home. The child comes home reciting scripture, singing it in the car. A man saying, I'm driving my kids, and I hear them in the back seat with their friends talking about Van Gogh. And talking about Mozart, conversations I never had as a kid, never expected to hear in my own car. And so I think about that early church father who said that but the glory of God is a human being fully alive. I think it's this type of education that really brings people into great human flourishing with their Creator in this incredible world we live in.
Robert, I'd love to come to you because, I walk up and down the halls, and I can't think of a public school where I've seen parents come and hug teachers. I haven't seen a situation where the kids all have a smile on their face. I haven't been in any schools lately, and I've done the public schools, the Christian schools and everything, where you come in and everybody stands and is respectful. You are probably struck by that, even though now you've been there for a few years, by how different West Dallas Community School is, even to some of the better schools in the communities where you grew up.
Absolutely. I think I'm struck by it, and our visitors are as well. And that goes back to we really have a framework and a foundation for what we're trying to do with the kids. And ultimately, the scriptures are our authority in matters of life and thought. And so when I do see students hugging teachers and parents hugging teachers, it's the building, our prayers, the building would radiate Christ's love, and that the Holy Spirit would be present. And so parents see this family that they get to be a part of, and that their students are cared for and known. And it's not always easy. As you know, anyone growing up in a family knows that when you're close to people, you really get to know them. And so we actually will go through the difficult work of speaking to the heart of students. And so Bentley will have days where there's a student in his office, and he is able to speak to that student's heart, bring the parent in, lay out the scriptures. And I just, to not bring in God's word, which is living and active, into a situation like so many situations we face, I feel like we're just able to do so much more than another school would be able to do, who wasn't able to put the scriptures at the forefront.
Coming to the end of the interview, but Bentley, I know that's what causes you to get up in the morning, drive all the way downtown, and then cross the Trinity River, and then spend some time each day as the headmaster. So thank you for sharing the vision. But I know you have the vision that this not be the only school in the country that's doing this, but that this model could be replicated in communities all over the United States.
Yes. That is a vision of ours, and it's exciting to see it happening, and that we've been able to be kind of an open source support for other schools. So we have folks coming to us, it's an idea, it's a germ, or are they just a few years down their journey? Thankfully, we have relationships with other schools in Memphis and Indianapolis, and that are very similar to West Dallas Community School. So God has done these different things, all their own unique stories. They might have their own Arville Wilson, they might not. It might look a little different, but our story is so unique, and I'm just I pinch myself that I get to stand on the shoulders of Norman Carroll, Sanju, and Michael, and Robin Lewis, and Pastor and Mrs. Wilson, and say, gosh, thank you. And to Tom Newhoff and others who invested so much in this school. Again, it's just an honor and a privilege, but it is exciting to see that there's a movement, and we pray that we can help fan those flames of that movement. And we'd really like to see it flourish. Of course, we want our own school to continue on by God's mercy, but see it go elsewhere.
Well, again, the legacy of 20 years, just amazing. And I think it shows that it can work. And if people want to know more about how you did it and how they might be able to do it in their community, they can contact both of you, can't they?
Yeah, please. We'd love to hear from anybody.
It's just been great to have you both in studio today.
Thank you.
Robert, thank you so much for joining us. And Bentley, let's do it again. We'll see if we can get you in the studio. And just before we finish, let's again mention that there is that luncheon for those of you in Dallas might want to attend. But for all of you, we again have the article, which I really do encourage you to read. It's a fascinating article, A School for Inner City Shalom. Of course, we have the link to West Dallas Community School and the video. It's 7 minutes long, but it gives you a little bit of the history, and it's something that you might want to watch. Then click on that share button. Put it on your Facebook page. If you have a blog, put it there. Maybe send it to someone who needs to know. And for those of you that would like to listen to it again, it's on the podcast, and you can download that and watch it or listen to it. And we need to take a break, but we'll be back with more right after these important messages.
Across the nation, this is Point of View. For materials offered during the broadcast, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221, or call our toll-free number 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Let me ask you a question. What do these people have in common? Steve McQueen, Ronald Reagan, Josh Hamilton, George Washington, Mickey Mantle, William Murray, and we can go through a very long list, but I won't go through all of those. Well, the answer is they all surrendered their hearts to Jesus Christ. And we're going to talk about some of the amazing stories of divine intervention with an individual who's also written up in the latest issue of the American Family Association Journal, Brush with Death, Still Bringing Life. And that is the testimony as well of James Lee Lambert. And he is an individual that secured his undergraduate degree from Linfield College there in Oregon, and has worked as management consultant and in management with a number of different banks over the years. He's also, of course, taken the time to bring many of these stories that we're going to be talking about today to various individuals. He's been on a number of different TV and radio programs, and we are just thrilled that he can join us by phone today. Should I call you James or Lee?
James is fine.
Okay, James, I appreciate you joining us today, and I noticed that people also sometimes use the name Lee as kind of another way, but I was reading about you, first of all, in the American Family Association Journal about how you oftentimes have told your own story. And so before we tell the story of people like Steve McQueen and, say, Mickey Mantle, I'd love to hear your own story, because it's pretty exciting, I think, as well.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity of sharing on your fine radio network. Actually, there was a time in my life I lived in Dallas, which I guess is a home to some of your stations. I grew up in Southern California, and my parents came to the West Coast prior to the war because the war was calling, and a lot of people were called up to serve against the war against Japan. And my father came to the West Coast from a little town called Henderson, Kentucky, and he came and served in the military and the Marines. He was an instructor of people, a rifle instructor, sharpshooter, and he was in Camp Matthews here, which is very close to where the town of La Jolla is, which is on the coast. And I was fortunately born during the baby boom generation, and had really a pretty nice childhood. Where things started going astray is my second year of college. A lot of young people at that time, and sadly even today, they get involved in experimenting in drugs, and that's what happened to me. And it just changed my outlook on life. There was a time I'll not ever forget where for about 3 months I thought I lost my mind. I had a LSD trip, and I was hallucinating on and off, and it really scared me.
Wow.
But I still, hung around the same people, and still, willfully, I take full, credit for my lifestyle, and I made the wrong choices, and it got to the point where I had a car accident when I was driving down during Thanksgiving break.
Crashed your Ford van.
Right, exactly, and I should not have a leg right now, and I went home and
I went back to college, and I was really depressed, and started really thinking about life. And little did I know that people were praying for me, and this is where the power of prayer is so powerful.
And then you had a knock on the dorm room door.
Exactly. It was a knock on a dorm room door, and a friend of mine who I noticed his life had changed quite a bit presented the gospel to me via the Four Spiritual Laws track, and it totally changed my life. I totally gave up drugs instantaneously. In fact, it was unbelievable. I mean, I used to cuss periodically, and God took that away from me. I mean, I just had no desire to do that. I had a bunch of secular records that I sold. I said, I don't have any need for this anymore. And people thought I'd flipped out. I mean, I was on a floor where drugs, you could almost get high walking down this floor in college. And God just totally just rescued me and brought me to a couple that had moved there, and their adventure was pretty miraculous too. How they came and this guy became a janitor of the college, and he started inviting kids over to their house and telling about Christ, because I knew nothing about the Gospels other than I knew that according to the Four Spiritual Laws, I had to start reading the Bible, which I did, regularly, and just over a period of time, God just totally changed my life. And I just thank God for Him making such a dramatic impact in my life. My wife, my girlfriend at the time, and now my wife accepted Christ, and a whole bunch of other kids did. I'm guessing 15 to 20% of the college during that time period got saved.
Wow.
Pretty amazing.
I might just mention, too, before we get to your book, is that I know, and this is something else I found out from the American Family Association Journal, that you oftentimes go on college campuses and hand out gospel tracts. And so you have been very much involved in kind of street evangelism. And, of course, we've talked with Ray Comfort about some of those issues in the past. And certainly you found that some students are very receptive to the gospel. Others maybe are hearing about it for the very first time. And others, of course, are hostile to it.
Well, it's amazing, and God is faithful. I mean, if you follow what He tells you to do, He will be there with you. And I've had some amazing encounters in these colleges. I've been to probably about 15 to 20 colleges, over 65 high schools, and do this. And, you do get harassment. I've had threats of arrest a number of times. I've had situations where the atheists are very upset about me being there. But you know what? The bottom line is, if you follow what God tells you to do, I mean, it's different with everybody. That's the important thing. And what I see in America today is a very great need for the gospel of Christ. I feel like that's the only solution to our problems. And as much as I've been involved in a variety of other cultural issues, I feel like this is the most important thing that America needs to come back to, and that's God.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the book, 16 Amazing Stories of Divine Intervention, including stories about 2 U.S. presidents, a Hollywood icon, famous athletes, rock musicians, as well as others that maybe you've never heard of. I think you'll find this is another very helpful book to maybe hand to a non-Christian friend, or maybe to use some of the stories as you would want to post something on your Facebook page. And we have information about that book on our website, pointofview.net. We have an article about it, and we also have a link to 16 Amazing Stories, the website, and there is a video. It's about 2 minutes long and something that you might want to watch or pass on to friends. But we'll come back. We'll talk about a few of those stories of individuals that have given their life to Christ. Some you may know. I suspect some will be new to you, and that's why we thought it would be an encouraging program today, and a reason why you might want to get a copy of the book that really goes into detail on some of these fascinating stories. 200-page book. It's available on our website, and we also have a link to 16amazingstories.com. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with James Lambert right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
Over the last few decades, I have followed the philosophical twists and turns of the environmental movement. As a student, I participated in the first Earth Day back in 1970 by inviting a Sierra Club leader to speak to my high school. I've also noticed how environmentalism almost became a religion. The philosophy of pantheism began to gain more prominence in the movement, and Earth worship almost became a foundational tenet of environmentalism. I've also noticed an increasing condemnation of the free market within the environmental movement, and there was always the belief that the only solution to many of our environmental problems was a global government. Nevertheless, I was always uncomfortable when a speaker at a political event or a guest on my radio program would link environmentalism to communism. You've probably heard the line, the environmental movement is like a watermelon, green on the outside, red on the inside. But you know, the latest environmental declaration makes me think that those observations weren't too far off target. Environmental activists from 130 different environmental groups call for an end to capitalism and the free market system. The Margarita Declaration, which was drafted in Venezuela, declares that global warming cannot be stopped without ending the capitalist system. You know, actually, a free market and private property are important tools in dealing with most forms of pollution. You know, if you own your land, you're likely to take care of it. If everyone owns the land, like in socialism, often nobody takes care of it. Professor Garrett Harding called this the tragedy of the commons. You could also call it the tragedy of the public restroom. Think of a mess in a typical public restroom. Now compare that to the bathroom in your home. When something is held in common, no one feels the same responsibility as when they own it themselves. So, you know, we may have environmental problems to address in our world, but ending capitalism and the free market is not the way to solve them. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Conversation today with James Lambert. If you'd like to join us a little bit later, we'll open up the phones again. 16 amazing stories of divine intervention. Tim Wildman, president of American Family Association, said, next to the work of the Holy Spirit himself, nothing challenges us to commit our lives to Christ more than the stories and testimonies of other Christ followers. In this volume, James Lambert offers a collection of such moving stories in a diverse lineup of pro athletes, historical, former entertainment icons, and more. Read and enjoy, be encouraged and challenged. Since it's baseball season, let's start out with the story of Mickey Mantle. I know, James, that when you've talked about this before on other programs, people are oftentimes completely unaware of this most valuable player, one of the great players in baseball. Went to so many World Series, native of Oklahoma, actually came to Christ before he died.
Oh, yeah, amazing story. What's interesting about Mickey is the number of times he rejected Christ. It went on for maybe 30 years. His friend Bobby Richardson, who I interviewed for this story, as well as Pat Summerall, who left us and is with Christ right now. He's a born-again Christian. Both were interviewed, and they had a very important part in his life. As far as friendship and eventually coming to Christ. But what happened is when Mickey's father died, probably a year and a half after he actually joined the Yankees, being on their regular team, he started changing quite a bit. He got involved in alcohol, and it really changed his life. In fact, the reason why Billy Martin, one of the reasons it is said that he was traded as a player from the Yankees is because they were concerned that he was having a negative effect on Mickey's life, because they were carousing and hitting the saloons and stuff, and he just changed. Alcohol did have a major impact on his life. He said he probably would have had a better career. It's hard to believe because he had such a great career as it was if he stayed away from the alcohol. He admitted that in a 1994 front page story by Sports Illustrated.
Mm-hmm.
What happened is he went through these trials during his life, and
then he had a number of injuries, which you talk about in the book there as well, which might have also led to some of that. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, but see what happened. Yeah, I think the father leaving him had a big impact on his life. But ultimately, what happened is after he had some personal tragedies, his wife left him. What happened is and I think we have an idea, but I haven't had it confirmed, but there was a former player that gave him a Pete Maravich testimony tape.
Right. And you had talked about that, and that was from Focus on the Family, of all things.
Right.
Yes.
Pretty amazing. That shows you that God can use anything. You know, this broadcast, anything He can use to stir people to faith in Christ. And he viewed that, and he noticed some comparisons between him and Pete. Pete had some problems with alcohol too, but God used that tape to touch his life and stir his a newborn faith in Christ. And one of the first calls he made was to Bobby, and Bobby was so excited to hear that he accepted Christ when he was in Dallas that he flew from his home in the Carolinas with his wife, and they went through the whole plan of salvation again.
Mm-hmm.
And sadly, 2 weeks later, he passed away.
But again, a lot of people don't know that story. And again, one of the things that I would say about your book is that it would probably be something you could hand to individuals that maybe know one of these individuals. And of course, we're talking about some historical figures like George Washington. We're talking about people that have lived in the contemporary period of time. Of course, there's one by about Ronald Reagan and Mickey Mantle and Bill Murray. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Then there are some people that you wouldn't know, but their stories are really powerful. Former Playboy bunny, or a former witch, and it's an encouraging one. And I think it is, as we just read a minute ago from Tim Wildman, another way to maybe share the gospel. I mean, we all certainly yesterday talked about gospel tracts and using the moral law, but certainly another way in which we could get people's attention in terms of evangelism is to use your book. And Mickey Mantle may not be as well known to people now, but for those of us that followed baseball and remember Maris and Mantle and all of the things that were happening in the Yankees and the success story, it is just encouraging again to find that story out. And for most people, that's probably new information that Mickey Mantle became a Christian.
Yeah, and it should be of interest to a lot of people in the Oklahoma area because that's where he was raised. In fact, one of the scouts, one of the things that they noticed when he was an 18-year-old boy, 17, 18-year-olds, he was playing against 21, 20, early 20-year-old boys in these leagues. It wasn't even a official league, but it was like a club league. He said his home runs were so towering, it was like supernatural. And that's why he said, I'm going to come back when this kid's out of high school. I'm going to sign him to a contract, because he couldn't believe how long his home runs were, just like record proportions. And the same thing happened when he was in the pros, too. There were a number of games, probably 4 or 5 games, where he actually hit the ball out of the stadium.
Pretty incredible. Let me take one other one before we take a break here, and that is another story that I mentioned, and you certainly talk about in some of the radio interviews that you've done in the past, and that's the story of Steve McQueen. Now, again, this is an actor, but I would imagine most people would say, well, he was kind of the king of cool. He's kind of an icon, but I don't know that very many people know that he also became a Christian.
No, they don't. And the thing is, for people that don't think he's still popular, just go onto YouTube. There's probably about 2 million to 3 million hits on videos he's done. Steve, a lot of people don't know this, but his mother was an alcoholic. His father left him when he was 6 months old. Had a really tough upbringing. There was times in his teen years he was living on the streets. He got in a fight with his stepfather and threatened to kill him. And that's when they sent him to the Boys Republic. Really a troubled kid. The only time he was really happy when he lived on a farm with his uncle for a year or so. But he had a tough life. And then, he got in the service after he went out to Boys Republic. He became very supportive in his later years of that, because he said it helped turn his life around. And after he was in the service, he went to acting school in New York, met Nell Adams, and they got married. She was in a Broadway play, and she was lured to Hollywood, and he followed her, and they found out about his skill too, and he was hired. And Frank Sinatra took liking to him. He had sort of a fallout with Sammy Davis Jr. on a film, and Steve played the other part, took the part of Sammy Davis that he would have had, and things just went from there. But he did have problems, he was known to be a womanizer. He knew to have some substance problems, and didn't have much direction in his life at all, and went through 2 marriages, and the second one was Ally McGraw. But God got a hold of him. The gospel was shared with him by his karate instructor first, same guy that shared Christ with Chuck Norris, that had an impact on his life. But then it was, he got sort of bent on, and a lot of people don't know this, but at that time in the early 70s, he and Paul Newman were the highest paid male actors in Hollywood. And what happened is he sort of got tuned out to the whole Hollywood scene, and he lived in an airplane hangar by himself for 6 months.
Wow.
Santa Paula. He really got tuned out, and he was really into toys, as a lot of people remember, motorcycles, race cars. He got into biplanes and asked for the best instructor in the area, and that turned out to be Sammy Mason, who had a dramatic impact on his life. Sammy shared the gospel. He was not only spoke about Christ, but he lived the Christian lifestyle, and Steve really knows that. And about 6 months thereafter, he went, after going to his church for some time, he accepted Christ, and he was dramatically changed. It wasn't something that was, on the surface. It was real.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to focus maybe on a few others, kind of a few presidents there. We'll maybe look at George Washington, Ronald Reagan, but some other stories there as well, part of the 16 amazing stories of divine intervention. And we have James Lambert with us. If you'd like to know a little bit more, first of all, we have information about the book on our website. We also have a link to 16amazingstories.com that you can find it there. And we also have a video, 2 minutes, that might give you a little bit of a sense of what we are talking about today. If at any point you'd like to join our conversation, we again are talking about evangelism and the value of testimonies. We'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. We'll have more right after this.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. We've been talking about evangelism sometimes these weeks, and I've really given you a chance during some of these programs to talk about sharing your faith, some things that have been effective for you. And today, working for a few more minutes with James Lambert as we talk about his book, 16 Amazing Stories of Divine Intervention. It includes stories about U.S. presidents, a Hollywood icon, famous athletes, rock musicians, a former gang leader, a former witch, other remarkable lives. And we're going to, for just a few minutes, James, I think, might talk about two presidents, and then we'll get into some of these people that maybe aren't as well known. But whether you talk about George Washington or Ronald Reagan, there have been some people that have really wondered about their Christian conviction, because whether you talk about George Washington, who did not really go to church very often in the 18th century, or Ronald Reagan, who rarely went to church when he was president in the 20th century, there have been some people that have had some questions. So as you've investigated the life of George Washington, there have been some that have wondered about his Christian conviction. What did you find?
Okay, I found a lot. I got access to a private library owned by a family, a publisher that had over 200 of his personal writings. I also got access to a book that was written and published a year after he died by his pastor that talks about his religious convictions. And yes, he did go to church regularly when he was living in New York and he was president. And when he was in Philadelphia, it was a little bit more difficult when he's in Mount Vernon, because the closest church was a couple hours away. And if the weather was bad, you're talking about a 4 or 5 hour trip one way. So that was bogus. Also, the Mason thing was bogus because it was more like a USO in the 1700s. It became strange and almost New Age-ish when the Illuminati got involved in 1811. But prior to that, it was a lot different. There's a number of quotes in the book by his close friends about his Christian faith. And also I put some of his writings in there he would allude to. And if you go into the House of Representatives, there's a famous picture of him praying near Valley Forge. And he prayed a lot. So, I discount the fact he was a very strong Christian. In fact, he was the only of the founding fathers that freed his slaves, and it was because of his religious conviction. A lot of people don't know this, but during his second term, Washington actually tried to free or make slavery illegal and disband it. This was unheard of at the time, and the reason that didn't happen is because the country was so new and fragile. He thought the agricultural states, primarily the ones in the South, would leave the Union if that happened, and that's why it didn't develop. But I tell this story and give these quotes in a number of African American churches that I speak in, because I think it's important to see that God can change anybody. You know, that's really important to know. Whether you're a very wealthy man, which he was back then, he inherited a number of a bunch of land from his father and his and another one of his relatives, or if you're someone that's relatively poor, like Reuben de la Torre.
Let's say we can, just before we get into some of those others, talk about Ronald Reagan, because that was another issue that people used to say, well, if Ronald Reagan is a Christian, he doesn't seem to go to church very often. But you found out that there was a very good reason for that.
Well, after what I found out from Ed Meese, I heard this. I interviewed him. He was a close friend. He was also his attorney general for several years in the White House.
Right.
And he said they would regularly go across the street to a church, which I visited, across from Lafayette Park, and pray for the country. He became a little paranoid after the whole incident with his, assassination attempt, and he felt that God allowed him to live because the bullet came within an inch of his heart. And he felt very impressed that one of the important things in his life is to see that Gorbachev open up the churches in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And that was one of the first concessions he got from Gorbachev in 1985. So he felt that there was a reason for that, and God pricked his heart. His mother, he became a Christian when he was a young man in his early teens, and I got a copy of a letter that he wrote when he was in his White House to his youth pastor when he was in junior high, and it showed him how much he impacted his life with the gospel message. His mother routinely would go to prisons on the weekends, and a young Ronald made a decision for Christ when he realized the stark difference between the way his mother was living his life and the way his father was living his life. His father had problems with alcohol. One afternoon, he discovered his father when he was living in Illinois on a sort of a ledge going up to their apartment, and he was drunk, and he had to be helped into the house.
Mm.
And that had an impact on his life, his young life. And young Ronald made some wise choices as far as his spiritual growth. Everyone makes mistakes, but he was definitely committed in his beliefs towards Christ. In fact, his son told me, Michael, told me that on one of his last trips on Air Force One, he pointed up to the clock, and Mike said, "What's that? What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, just a few days left, and I'll be able to go to church." He just felt paranoid about going to church in a public setting with a lot of people as president.
Yeah, because it is disruptive, and I understand that that's been a comment from many presidents, from George Washington all the way down to our current president, but that at least helps answer some of that question. Yeah. I wanted to keep it moving because you had some others, and I thought it was interesting that Pat Robertson, when he endorsed your book, one of the ones he talked about was the story of Brenda, who was a Miss USA beauty contestant and a Playboy bunny. And I thought
Virginia. Miss Virginia, in fact, and she was in the top 10 in the in the Miss USA contest. She rested her hopes in Hollywood. She went there, and she unfortunately got involved with the wrong people. Got involved with Playboy and became a Playboy bunny. Got involved in that whole party scene. She started. When I interviewed her in Kentucky, she talked about, she's now a minister's wife, and she talked about all the, movie stars that were hanging out and having free love at the mansion. And I thought, man, I better not mention these names because I'll get a lawsuit because there were so many famous names there. But sadly, she got involved in the drug culture, and, she just felt her life was worthless after a while because, that's all she felt like she was good for is, performing sex and getting involved in the whole sex scene, and wow. She tried to kill herself. And it was the grace of God through her pastor in Virginia, and also through some influences that she had in her life, where she really changed. And that's really what happened. God got a hold of her life, and shows that God can reach anybody. In fact, I challenged her to write a letter to Hugh Hefner, which she did.
How about that?
To share the gospel with him.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll maybe get into a couple others. You mentioned just a minute ago Ruben De La Torre, Lefty as he was known, a former gang leader. I think some people certainly would remember some of the testimonies of other gang leaders like Nicky Cruz, but this is one that you have prominent in the book, and we'll get into just a few others real quickly because these stories oftentimes can have a real impact on young people. They can be used in an evangelistic way, and that's why we wanted you to know about this book, 16 Amazing Stories of Divine Intervention. I've mentioned a few people that have endorsed the book. I've mentioned already Tim Wildman and his endorsement, Pat Robertson, who was really struck by the story of Brenda that we just talked about. Chuck Smith talks about another one that was a disciple Timothy Leary, and many of these endorsements all, again, remind us of the fact that these stories can be very powerful and useful in your evangelistic outreach. And it also is just interesting to find out that some of these people that the mainstream secular press really never talks about in terms of their Christian conviction actually made a commitment to Jesus Christ. So I think you'll find the book interesting just from a reading point of view and learning a little bit more about the lives of some of these individuals, but I think it also could be a very effective tool for evangelism, and that's why we have information about it on our website, pointofview.net. We'll come back and hear one or two more stories just before we wind down the program today. James Lambert with us. The book is entitled 16 Amazing Stories of Divine Intervention. We'll be back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk with James Lambert about his book, 16 Amazing Stories of Divine Intervention. James, certainly you want to talk about a couple of them, but I thought one that we might get into real quickly, a former gang leader's remarkable story, and that's Ruben Lefty De La Torre.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Could I give you my number, too, my 800 number?
I guess so.
Yeah. If people want to call me directly, they can call me at 1-800-656-8603. That's 1-800-656-8603. Yeah, Ruben De La Torre, you'll find him to be quite an exceptional person. He grew up in southeast San Diego. At age 9, got involved with gangs. Sadly enough, became a gang leader by age 14, 15 years old. By his early 20s, he was in prison. And he was selling drugs. The man, his life was on a downward spiral. And when he got out after almost 20 years in jail, he felt he needed to put a hit out on somebody. And he was low on money, and he looked in his pocket, and he had some names of places to stay, and there was a name of a Reverend Guzman in there, and he didn't know it was a pastor. He stayed at his house. And he allowed him to come into his house. He was a guy, a stranger and everything. He was amazed because he was always into being the tough guy and everything. And the guy didn't mention the gospel at all for almost a month, and just showed him love and practiced what he preached. And finally, Reuben asked him, I said, why are you acting like this? And he told him it was about Christ. And he brought him to church, and within a few weeks, Reuben decided to commit himself to Christ. I interviewed him a few years ago in a very tough neighborhood of southeast San Diego. In fact, I didn't feel that safe when I was in the neighborhood. And this house that he was mentoring these young men, Reuben was mentoring them. He was trying to help them get out of gangs. And it's with a group called Victory Outreach.
Outreach, yeah.
And he was there, and he's telling me a story, and I was just blown away about how this man had changed and how committed he was to the gospel. And God really touched his life. In fact, it took a few years for his parents to be convinced that his life had changed, because all they knew was the negative side of Reuben for so long. But Reuben is really a changed person. It shows you how dramatic someone can be changed by the power of Christ. Some of the other stories you mentioned about, there's a former witch. Her name is Annie Meadows. Heavily involved in witchcraft for 15 plus years. And I was about a year and a half ago. I was at Amy Grant's house, and she was on concert. And I told her staff there, I said, "You got to give Amy this message." And it was a song that she wrote in one of her albums, El Shaddai, that really touched
Annie.
Annie, just touched her life while she was going through all these different crises in her life. And she started becoming open to the gospel then. Her boyfriend at the time had an impact on her life, but she was heavily involved in the occult. Some of the stuff she was telling me that she was doing, I used to not think it was possible, but after hearing her story, I thought, anything's possible. And she comes out, she now goes around the country. She's a gospel singer and sings in churches, and she has a radio show on in Nevada, Las Vegas.
Incredible. Well, we've covered about half of them, and I don't want to cover them all because people need to get the book and read it. But just before we let you go, let's talk, James, for just a minute, how people can use the book, because obviously, as I've been talking about, I think most people will be fascinated to hear these stories, and you're able to get into the lives of some of these individuals by either interviewing them or interviewing people that knew them. And you've done quite a bit of homework to understand more about them. Lots of endnotes at the end in case people want to know where that particular story came from. But I also think this would be a real good book to use in an evangelistic way. So before we let you go, talk about that.
I know. Well, I've gotten a number of letters from prisoners that have gotten saved or touched by the book. In prisons, they've used them. Ordinary people, I've known at least 3 people that were atheists that got saved through the book, and others too. If you have a friend that's a Yankees fan, Mickey Mantle, if you've got somebody that knows about Steve McQueen or are interested in Josh Hamilton, the baseball player, whatever it is, there's a lot of variety. There's a guy, I have all different ethnicities there. There's somebody for everybody. A couple rock musicians, a great story about Brian McLean with Group Love I got a chance to share with Paul Kantner from the Jefferson Airplane about a year ago. Because of his story, they were friends. Anything is possible. God can touch anybody, but testimonies seem to be very powerful and potent. That's why I encourage your audience to pick up this book. It also helps support my ministry of going around the country and sharing the gospel at these colleges. I'm planning on going to Colorado and doing that in front of these pot shops in Denver.
That'll be interesting.
Yeah.
Last time I was in Boulder, it was wild enough. I can't even imagine what it's like now. So nothing else.
Oh, it's sadly got degenerated in Denver from what I hear from people that live in the state. It's not good things have happened since they've legalized pot. So all I can say is, but anything's possible with God. God can do anything, and that's why this book is a great tool of sharing your faith with your friends. Because they're going to find one or two of the book and it's coming out as second edition. I've got some cleanup work. It's coming out as second edition sometime in the next 3 or 4 months too.
Very good. Well, let me again encourage people to find out a little bit more. And the good news is we also have a link to 16amazingstories.com. We have the video. And, of course, we have a little bit of a story and an excerpt of it so people can read the preface. And so, James, I appreciate you being on the program with us today.
Thank you very kindly. I appreciate the opportunity, and I wish great blessings for your program.
Let's just, before we finish off today, mention that we do have a number of things that you might want to find on our website. First of all, in the first hour, we spent some time talking about West Dallas Community School, and that was an opportunity here from Bentley Craft and Robert Hunt, and I think they did an outstanding job of really sharing with you the vision that I have, and I think so many people have, of taking these ideas and making them a reality. And we certainly need to reach out to the poor in our communities and to provide them with a quality education, a Christ-centered education. And I think this is something that the church needs to do. I think private individuals need to do. We cannot depend on the government to do it. Even if they do, we know what will happen there. And so I certainly appreciate their vision. And we have the video that is about 7 minutes long. We have information about that particular school. And we also have the article, A School for Inner City Shalom. Second hour today, we talked with James Lambert, and that was an opportunity for you to hear a little bit more about his book, 16 Amazing Stories of Divine Intervention. It's available on our website if you would like to get a copy. We have a short introduction to it as well, and then also a 2-minute video that you might want to use as well. And so please take the time to visit the website, pointofview.net. As you go there, if you would like to listen to or watch the program again, we have the podcast and the live cast, and that is available. Just click on that podcast button. If you'd like to follow us on Facebook, click on the Facebook page. Of course, we have our own YouTube channel, so you can click on YouTube and watch these programs. And there are just lots of ways that you can follow us. Don't forget that you can also click on that button that says Get Involved. And I hope as you do that, we'd also encourage you to click on that button that says Donate. That's a way in which you can support this ministry. Hope you appreciate the kind of information that we have provided with you today. We recognize that sometimes it's good to get out of the news cycle, but we'll be right back into it tomorrow, Friday weekend edition. Benedextra will be hosting that program, so I hope you'll join us then. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Chris for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
You have been listening to Point of View. For materials offered on the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.